Hello, how are we doing? Just while we're doing the sound check, I thought I'd say that we've recently discovered that Leonardo's most famous drawing, apparently a Vitruvian man, is actually of his favourite yoga position. It's the beginning of the salutation to the sun. Hot news, but I wanted to get the ball rolling by, well, first of all, congratulating Martin on just such a fantastic exhibition. We're spoilt for drawing exhibitions in London at the moment. There's the Rembrandt at the British Museum and this absolutely eye-watering, amazing show here. But first of all, I just wanted to ask Martin if he could explain to everyone here how on earth it is, that all of these astonishing drawings came to be in the British Royal Collection. Why are they here?
Well, they've been with us for 350 years now. It's extraordinary that these drawings have been together as a group since Leonardo's death. They've always been together as essentially Leonardo's archive that was in his studio at his death. And it passed through only about 3 or 4 hands before these drawings came into the collection. Leonardo died here, the Chateau of Clos-Lucé, in 1519, and left all his drawings to his favourite pupil, Francesco Melzi, who was probably the artist of that portrait of Leonardo that you maybe saw as you entered the exhibition. He took them back to his family villa, Villa Melzi, which is this white building up on a hill there, in a painting by Bernardo Bellotto of about 250 years later. It still stands there. You can visit Villa Melzi, and there are still Melzis living in the same building. You can stand at a window that Leonardo stood at to make a landscape down in the Adda Valley below. And Melzi was devoted to the memory of Leonardo, but when Melzi died, his son Orazio had less interest in their reliquary quality, and he soon passed them on to a sculptor, Pompeo Leoni, who you see on the right here. Leoni was one of a number of people through European history who've been obsessed by Leonardo. He was gathering Leonardo drawings from all quarters, and he bound the drawings, 600 of them, into this one album. And it's that album that came to England somehow in the 1620s. We don't know quite how it arrived in England, but it was in the possession of the Earl of Arundel, Thomas Howard, who was the greatest collector of drawings in 17th century Europe. He had agents all over Europe who were scouring collections to try to acquire not individual drawings, but entire other collections to be shipped to England. And this may well have been an acquisition by one of Arundel's agents.
Because Charles I himself didn't particularly like drawings.
No, he didn't. I mean, the collecting of drawings has always been very much an acquired taste, because you can't really display drawings. I mean, obviously we're displaying them here in a gallery, but this is very much a modern phenomenon. Charles I, although he was such a great collector of paintings, sculpture, tapestries, and so on, drawings seem to have excited his interest not at all. And Arundel, in the 1620s and 30s, was really the only English collector of drawings of any note at that time. It comes in about 50 years later with Peter Lely, and then Richardson and Reynolds and Lawrence and so on in the 18th century. It's often artists who are the collectors of drawings. But Arundel was really unique, and more surprising then that he seems not to have taken the drawings into exile when he left England in 1641 at the start of the Civil War. And we think, the documentation is so sparse, but it seems that his grandson, this splendid gentleman on the left, Henry Howard, later 6th Duke of Norfolk, seems to have been looking after aspects of his grandfather's collection. And I believe, this is a hunch, there's no document, I must repeat, that it was he, Howard, who gave the album to Charles II around 1670, maybe in thanks for his elevation to Earl Marshal or for the restoration of the Norfolk lands and titles at the restoration of the monarchy, we just don't know. But by 1670, Charles II has the possession of that one album. Now, we have the husk of it on display at the start of the exhibition. It looks quite thin now, but once that was bursting with about 600 drawings by Leonardo, it's today would be inestimable. But it was a single acquisition.
And how many drawings out of that 600 still remain in the Royal Collection?
Oh, all of them. Actually, there's one. One escaped in the 19th century. It's in Weimar now. We don't know how that happened. But other than that, they're all with us still. But my interest is how they were seen at that time, what Charles II thought he acquired. Now, your great documentary series on the Royal Collection took in all aspects of the collection and all periods. So what, Andrew, do you think would have been thought of such an album at that time? How was it seen by Charles II and his contemporaries?
I honestly don't know. I mean, I think the fact that it survived and the fact that it was looked after suggests that it was certainly seen as being important, but whether there was such a thing as a connoisseur of drawing, and whether I imagine that things like a number of the drawings, such as the drawing of the embryo or some of the more, as it were, grisly drawings, were perhaps seen as curiosities, or that Leonardo was possibly regarded as something of an eccentric figure more than as a great genius.
Yeah, undoubtedly.
How we think of him now.
Yes. I mean, if we think of the period, the Royal Society has just been founded. You have people who are curious about the world around them in all its aspects, and Charles II, of course, was a patron of the Royal Society, but there's no evidence that even somebody like John Evelyn knew of this album. He may have done, but we don't know that he did. And drawings like the two that I've just put on the screen now, this beautiful profile study of a horse, and then casting studies for the Sforza monument, I think you're right, would have been seen as curiosities.
They take quite some deciphering.
They do.
I mean, if you imagine that somebody without much training, because Leonardo was considerably further ahead than they were, if you like.
Yes.
So how would they necessarily even connect that drawing with its left-handed back to front mirror writing, which they probably couldn't read? How would they even connect that to necessarily the problems of casting, unless they were looking at them really, really closely, and who necessarily had time to do that?
Some people do seem clearly to have looked at the album in more depth than others. We have Rubens, for example, at the start of the 17th century. He made copies from sheets in the album. William Hunter, the great anatomist, saw it almost 200 years later in George III's library, and he was struck by the quality of the anatomical drawings, such as those that we have on the wall here.
Makes me wonder if Stubbs ever saw it.
Well, I think that's very likely, actually. I think Hunter, who was friends of Stubbs, I think it's hard to imagine that Hunter didn't mention to Stubbs that these incredible drawings were there, but it's a tantalizing lack of evidence of that, unfortunately. But in the 17th century, when this album was acquired, the drawings were probably completely muddled up. I mean, there may have been some grouping by subject. Maybe one can imagine all the horses would have been together, all the landscapes together, the maps, for example. But the layout that we have in the exhibition here, that's chronologically, thematically developed, where you get a sense of Leonardo's interests evolving during the course of his life, that would not have been evident to anybody on a casual or even day-long viewing of the album. It would just have been this amazing sweet shop of different subjects all crammed together into a single album. And
how, in terms of, you begin the exhibition with some drawings by other artists. Lorenzo Credi, a beautiful drawing of a lily by Andrea del Verrocchio.
Yeah, we've got that one here.
Yeah. Who in whose studio Leonardo was.
Yes.
To what extent does Leonardo take the drawing and reinvent it as a creative tool for the artist?
Well, I really wanted to emphasize, just by having that small group of drawings at the start of the exhibition, that Leonardo isn't unique. It's very tempting to see him as this, complete one-off who almost exists out of time. There's the tendency of people who approach Leonardo from one very narrow subject to see him as a modern artist, marooned, as a modern thinker, marooned in the 15th century, must be resisted. And a drawing such as this by, well, I believe by Verrocchio, it had been called Leonardo in the past, but other drawings by Lorenzo di Credi of an ox, for example, and studies of figures from the life. I wanted to show that Leonardo is not the only figure in 1470s Florence who's drawing animals, drawing plants, drawing the human figure in as much detail as possible. But what Leonardo then goes on to do in subsequent decades is, if not unique, in that he's an artist who is making engineering studies and scientific studies and so on, because a handful of other artists are doing that. But he takes it so much further than anybody else. What have we got next? I mean, this is a drawing from the 1470s. So Leonardo's about 25, 26 years old, I think, when he makes this. And it shows, I think, such an excitement with the possibilities of drawing. There's such a sort of frenzy of creation in this drawing. And I can't think of another drawing by a contemporary of Leonardo's that has got this thrill of creating new worlds on a sheet of paper.
Quickly.
Incredibly quickly in some cases. Very painstakingly in others. I mean, this is one of the questions I'm often asked about Leonardo. How long did it take him to make that drawing? And it's a question I can never answer, but it's very clear that some drawings are the work of a few seconds and others he would labour over for probably days.
When I think of the great draftsman of his time, I mean, the other artist I would think whose drawings are a sort of priceless treasure would maybe be Pisanello.
Yeah.
But they seem to me to be much more functionally connected to the designing of medals or Renaissance costumes or all of the things that Pisanello did as a court artist. Whereas Leonardo's, it seems to me that when you look at some of his drawings, it's as if you're watching the flow of his thought from one idea to the next, and that he's not necessarily, and you get this a bit from his writing as well, you get the sense that he becomes so lost in what he's doing that it's almost as if the point of it's been forgotten, and the point of it is to find out where he's going to go.
Yeah. I think what you're seeing in Pisanello is clearly an intense curiosity about the appearance of the world around him. There's something maybe superficial about those drawings. You know, he's interested in what it looks like so he can then transfer that into a painting. It's a stock of images.
Yeah, no, that's what I mean.
Yes,
I
exactly.
feel with Leonardo, he might start doing that. And maybe this is a different subject, is perhaps his tendency never to finish what he begins, but he starts perhaps studying something because it's going to go into a painting. And then he thinks, I wonder why it does that. And
yes.
I wonder, why does it have the stem that goes in that direction? Yeah. How strong is that? And
I think the very act of making a drawing, I mean, as it does for all of us, you make a drawing and you're compelled to think about the structure. It's the best way to learn about how something is made is to draw it. And Leonardo takes that and doesn't just go, that's interesting, but then turns it inside out and wants to think about and then explore. And I think that's when Leonardo becomes unique as an artist-scientist, that he's really thinking deeply about the fundamentals of how something is constructed. I mean, we've got a couple of images here, for example, from this decade, from the 1480s, when Leonardo's career as a thinker really takes off. I mean, in the 1470s, the drawing, the double-sided sheet of studies of the Madonna in profiles, that's when he's in Florence, and he's very much an artist-craftsman. But in the 1480s, when he moves to Milan, this is when his interests suddenly diversify. He becomes the great thinker in all fields that we understand Leonardo to be today. And a drawing like this, which is very much preparatory for an artistic project. He's thinking about a composition, he's thinking in 3 dimensions because this is going to be realized as a sculpture. But having made this drawing, he then starts, what's happened here? He then starts to think about the underlying structure of horses and of men, and he makes dissections of not just animals of all kinds, but ultimately of men as well. And he starts to want to understand not just how they appear on the surface, which is what an artist needs to know, but what is life, what are the organs that sustain life, how are those organs connected, how do we think, how does the brain work, and so on. And it leads him down this sort of infinite rabbit hole of thinking. And he can never quite get to the end of any of it. This is the great tragedy of Leonardo.
I think Henry Fuseli said he was a libertine who wasted life fruitlessly in experiment, which is perhaps a bit rude, and maybe it could be applied to Fuseli himself, actually.
Well,
he was definitely a libertine. Yes. But this is for the Sforza monument in Milan, the great plaster cast of which was never cast in bronze and was sadly shot to pieces by the soldiers of Francis the First?
No, that would have been
Francis the
Louis
First
the
dad.
XII. Louis the XII.
His dad.
in fact. Yeah.
Yeah. So it is a great example of an unfinished thing. And he's thinking about Donatello. He's thinking about, well, certainly about Donatello, maybe about the Colleoni monument in Venice. I don't know.
I think it's very likely that when Leonardo was commissioned to make the Sforza monument, that he was dispatched by Ludovico Sforza to Padua and to Venice to study Donatello's Gattamelata in Padua and Verrocchio's Colleoni monument. I mean, that the undertaking of casting a huge equestrian bronze was immense, a great investment of time and of money by Ludovico Sforza.
Yeah. And sort of eventually gets scuppered for often the common reason that bronze is, they need the metal more for cannonballs than they do. So, yeah.
And instead, Leonardo was taken off this and onto the Last Supper, which we have these two studies, and we have only about 6 surviving preparatory drawings for the Last Supper, which was the project that Leonardo was put onto when the work on the Sforza monument was abandoned. And it took him 4 years to paint. It must have been the most immense effort of thinking to create this extraordinary composition, which, in a funny way, like many great famous works of art, we almost take for granted now. It takes quite an effort of imagination to see it through fresh eyes. And I think the preparatory drawings help us to do that somehow, that we can see Leonardo as he starts to think about the effects that he's trying to capture in it. I mean, how old were you when you first saw The Last Supper?
I was relatively old when I first saw it, because I never went to Milan, so I think I was probably about 25.
So you'd known it very well through reproduction already?
I'd known it, through reproductions. I think there was a series of books about single paintings, and I had the one that was about The Last Supper.
And how did it strike you when you saw it in the flesh for the first time?
Well, I think through all the terrible sort of fallings off of paint and the decay of the surface, you still do get a tremendously powerful sense of this. I think it's what struck me most was the sense that there was a single event that everybody's responding to at the same time, and they really are responding to it at the same time, not with stage makeup on, because I mean I knew before I saw it lots and lots and lots of Florentine Last Suppers, Ghirlandaio's and the like.
Yeah.
Andrea del Castagno's, which I think is fantastic, but much more solemn and almost Florentine, Byzantine.
They're quite static, aren't they?
They are static. They are. Whereas this painting is it's a bit like the great drawing of the Adoration of the Magi. It's got that same energy. It's almost as if a storm of emotion has passed through a crowd.
Yeah.
And it's almost like connects to the deluge drawings at the end of his life, that there's this almost like this emotional weather, and it's swept right across, and everybody's doing a different thing.
Yeah. And the head studies, of which we've got the studies for St. Bartholomew and Judas up on the screen here, they're surprisingly impassive, I find, in a way. I mean, this is one of the mysteries of the Last Supper, is that it's very hard to read their emotions if you take the faces in isolation. You've got to see this great sort of crashing waves of the composition and the hand gestures as well, are so crucial to one's reading of that particular painting. It's not that they all have tortured expressions on their faces. A couple do, a couple seem very much caught up in the emotion of the moment. But the drawings such as these show Leonardo interested in facial structure as much as facial emotion.
And I think I feel that there's often the sense in Leonardo where you have he's thinking about different types of time. And I mean, in the Mona Lisa, we were talking earlier before we began this evening, in the Mona Lisa, on the one hand, you've got the geological time of the landscape, and on the other hand, you've got the instantaneous time of a human smile, or the flicker of that smile. So you've got this sense of two vastly different measurements of time, if you like. And I sort of think, in a sense, that's present in the Last Supper as well.
Yes.
In that Christ represents eternity.
And Christ is very still.
And
He's a still centre.
He is the still centre around which everything moves.
Sort of explosion from the centre of an instantaneous emotional response but Christ is an eternal presence at the centre.
Yeah,
it's a very interesting reading.
Which is a common theological idea. I mean, you find the same contrast in Milton's Paradise Lost, where Christ is the one who never does anything. And the Satan, they're always doing things because it's in the nature of being damned to do things. And the closer you get to the state of doing nothing. So I think that who's the disciple who falls asleep on Christ?
St. John.
Yeah, so he's the one who's closest to Christ, and he's also the least active.
Yeah.
So there's this sort of idea running through it all. But it is extraordinary. I don't know enough about the conservation practice that's been used, but they do seem to have stabilised the painting now. And it is it's wonderfully impressive. I suppose the only way that one might perhaps get a sense of what it must have looked like in his mind, or as when it was just finished, would be there's that wonderful church on the outskirts of Florence in a suburb. I can't remember the name of the church, but it's got Andrea del Sarto's Great Last Supper, which is as big as this wall behind me. I mean, it's as big as the Leonardo Last Supper. And Andrea del Sarto is a great, great, great master. And it's in perfect condition. And it gives you if you imagine Leonardo's painting in that condition, you think, oh.
Yeah. Now, condition is something I wanted to touch on briefly, because one of the fantastic things about these drawings, because they were in this album for 300 years that came into the Royal Collection, they passed through very few hands. And works on paper, if you look after them, they are surprisingly robust. And you can see these drawings, such as you can see the Last Supper heads there, in essentially the way in which Leonardo saw them himself. So you get this real sense of immediacy of what Leonardo was intending. But the great exception is this, of course. Now, when you were filming for the BBC documentary series, you came into the conservation studio to see this, and this
Martin rather mischievously showed me this and said, "What do you think?" And it's the sort of thing you think. Well, actually, Martin having talked about that group of slightly hagiographic hoarders or keepers of the flame of Leonardo's drawings, if they'd been less hagiographically inclined, they would probably have thrown this sheet away.
Yes.
Because they would have said, well, but because it was with the others, they kept it.
Every sheet of paper was preserved like a little icon.
So presumably in their minds, Leonardo touched it. He never drew on it, but he touched it, so we'll keep it. And in fact, it turns out that silver point is very fugitive and can only be detected nowadays.
With the ultraviolet light.
You put ultraviolet light on these, and they are actually real drawings, just faded.
Yeah. And it's the great party trick, is to put that drawing under UV light, as we did for you.
Martin did it for me. So it was like, oh, how did you do that? I have the feeling that Leonardo himself would have really liked that.
Oh yeah.
It's the sort of joke he would have liked to play.
Yeah, I think that humorous, that jokey, almost tricksy aspect of Leonardo is something that needs more acknowledgement. There is this terrible tendency to think of Leonardo as always this sort of profound thinker, just a very serious figure. And the light-hearted aspect of Leonardo, the entertainer, somebody who's working as a court artist for 2/3 of his career, for Ludovico Sforza, for Giuliano de' Medici in Rome, for Francis I, for the French court in Milan. He was expected to produce entertainments.
Yeah.
And the contrast between the public Leonardo and the private Leonardo must have been profound. The sense that when he closed the door, his studio door at the end of the day, and got on with his researches, a very different Leonardo would have come out. And I think that what people would have seen Leonardo as in his own day would have been this very entertaining, jocular figure. We know he was gregarious, he could hold company, he could improvise songs and so on. He wasn't just a great painter. But the scientific side was hardly known. Not because he was wanting to keep it secret, he was just never wanting to, or never felt that he could reach a conclusion. And we had drawings like this. I mean, this is a drawing in the first section of the exhibition from quite early in Leonardo's career. He's about 32, 33 years old when he makes this drawing. And it's a very good example of how Leonardo starts to use paper to think, starts to use drawing and writing together to think. And it becomes this subcurrent then for the whole of the rest of his career.
It strikes me, well, we were again talking about this earlier, is that one of the revolutions in technology of the time is the fact that paper is suddenly available and much, much cheaper than it had been.
Yeah.
So the idea of making images that can be disposable or writing notes and experimental thoughts, writing them down, it's no longer very expensive to do that. And so in a sense, Leonardo's helped to be himself by this alteration.
Yeah.
And the idea of the portable notebook, so that he can go up into the mountains of Milan and study things like fossil forms and conclude from the fossil forms and various other evidence that he gathers that the creation account of the world as being, I think, 6,000 years old must be wrong. Because how did these sea creatures get up there and what's happened? You know, and he sort of, I think the problem is he's so, I mean, his watchword, isn't it, is take nothing for granted. That's almost his motto.
Yeah.
You know, take nothing for granted, which is the absolute opposite of a medieval scholastic approach to knowledge, in which you take only authority for granted. So
Yes.
you have authorities on everything under the sun. And if Galen said this, then it's true. If, such and such a Greek astronomer said this, it's true. So Leonardo's going, well, actually, I've kept scratching at the surface of all these things, and the deeper I get, the more I realize that all of our authorities are not true. And he's almost like a one-man empirical scientific laboratory.
Yeah. He's very conflicted about this, though. He's got a bit of a chip on his shoulder that he doesn't have Latin, that he doesn't know the classical authorities, and he sort of insists, he protests a little too much that experience is the way to learn about the world. He proclaims himself an homo senza lettere, a man without an unlettered
but
man.
we should be lucky, I suppose, like Shakespeare with little Latin and less Greek. But we should be lucky that Leonardo didn't have a humanist education, because then he would never have had that chip.
Exactly. But at the same time, he is very keen to learn about established knowledge from what must have been a very good, extensive group of contacts in the universities, in the courts of Milan, Florence, Rome, and Amboise. One of the biggest little gaps in our knowledge of Leonardo are these conversations that he must have had. We know in the case of the anatomical drawings that he was working alongside Marcantonio della Torre, the professor of anatomy at the University of Padua, and he learns about Galen from Marcantonio. He's reading Avicenna and Mondino and so on. He's got a library of more than 120 books by the age of 50, some of which are like the Decameron, for example, but others are treatises on engineering, on architecture, on the sciences. So at the same time as protesting his innocent eye, his wish to just go to nature and look and learn from the source book of nature, he's also buttressing that with the attempt to learn as much as he can. I mean, the drawing that we have on the left here, for example, this is a study done before Leonardo had conducted any dissection. And we must always beware when we look at a Leonardo drawing not to assume that he's seen what is drawn. In many cases, he's drawing what he believes to be true. So he isn't always looking directly at the source material. And this drawing, which makes a complete hallix of the cardiovascular system, is Leonardo essentially drawing a medieval version of the veins and the arteries, that the veins arise at the liver and they distribute nutrition throughout the body. The heart is the source of vital spirit of the life, and the arteries transmit. So Leonardo is drawing here essentially a medieval diagram, despite his wish to learn from nature.
But he does think outside the parameters that he inherits, doesn't he? In quite a few cases.
He does.
I mean,
he does.
And he sees things that other people haven't seen.
He does, and that becomes increasingly the case later on in his career. He gets confidence, he gets intellectual maturity into his 50s, which gives us all hope for our own careers. And it's this period of around 1505 to 1512. Many of the drawings, again, I keep pointing at this side of the gallery, but this is the absolute pinnacle of Leonardo's career as a thinker, that he has the confidence to contradict authority. He starts with trying to assimilate, as we see on the slides here, existing knowledge. He uses that as a basis to interrogate the natural world. And at this period, in his 50s, he then feels that he's got enough understanding for himself that he can start to take on the authorities. He can contradict the authorities. And it's a very almost sort of exhilarating moment in Leonardo's career. There's a certain nervousness about it that I think comes across in his writings at the same time, that he keeps stating the same thing again and again. It's as if he really wants it to be true, and if he writes it down often enough, then he has the confidence to believe it, in spite of what ancient authority would have him believe.
Share some what other slides do you have there?
Well,
so that's very interesting. So that's his plan to divert the Arno.
Yes.
For the Medici who hate Pisa. So isn't the idea that they want to starve Pisa, or not starve Pisa, but deprive them of water?
Well, there are two things going on in this. This is Leonardo just thinking with great excitement on a sheet of paper. Again, it's another of these drawings where he's working at a furious pace on this. He's using brush and ink, which is very unusual for Leonardo.
Is this about 1505?
Yeah, about that. Maybe a couple of years earlier, but around then. And there are two different schemes on this one drawing. The great loop, the great curve that you see over the top of the drawing is a canal, is a project for a canal to bypass the Arno. And it's only down at the bottom. Does this work? It probably won't work if I point at the screen. At bottom left, you see a couple of diagonal lines going top right to bottom left. And those lines are an intended cut to divert the Arno away from Pisa, because the Florentines were besieging Pisa. They've been besieging Pisa for about 9 months 9 years by now. And Leonardo and Machiavelli, who were good friends, came up with a plan together to dry the Arno to a riverbed by diverting the waters away from Pisa so that Pisa would be starved out. And Leonardo and Machiavelli made and digging actually started.
They did, 1,000 people started, and then there are some notebooks where he works out how many men can empty how many buckets of soil per day. And I think he realises that it's utterly hopeless.
They do start digging, though. They spend about 2 months digging.
Yeah,
and the banks collapse. Leonardo, who had such respect for the power of water to wear down mountains, should have known that just digging a ditch wasn't going to divert the Arno away from Pisa.
He had a very big ditch in mind. The funny thing is, he did understand the landscape well enough that where he traced this, the big arc, that is actually the motorway now. So he did get that was the, as it were, the path of least resistance. There's the fact that Leonardo simultaneously is studying water and the dynamics of water, and he's studying the human body, he's studying the human heart, reminds me of a story told to me there's a heart surgeon called Francis Wells. Mm-hmm. Francis Wells has made a great study of Leonardo's drawings of the heart, and in one of his researches, he noticed that Leonardo had written next to there's a heart valve, and it's got a little lump on it on either side, near the top, so that when it closes, those lumps are quite near the top. And modern science had decided that those lumps were totally irrelevant. They were a sort of evolutionary hangover from when we were fish, and they meant nothing. But in Leonardo's drawing, he says, those bumps are actually quite important, because when the blood comes flowing, they actually act through the fluid motion of a whirlpool, they act to help the valve to shut. And Wells thought, well, God, could that be true? And he noticed that a lot of people who had a problem with this heart valve, he just noticed they didn't have very much bump on their heart valve. And so he asked one of his patients if he could actually experiment, instead of cutting the valve off and replacing it with a plastic valve, which means that you live, but you're never going to go for a jog again, can I do some plastic surgery? So he did some plastic surgery. And this, he said, I couldn't believe it, this guy who couldn't walk, he's running up the stairs 2 weeks later. So this is Leonardo seeing something, just actually empirically, and because he's been asking Maestro Antonio from Flanders how they make dikes in Holland or whatever, he's really studying and asking everybody about how water works and how a lock opens and closes, and I think it uses, locks have similar things to create whirlpools to help the doors to shut. So, you know, there's a lot to be said for actually looking with your own eyes, or seeing, you know, he, in a sense, as well said to me, he's seen through not the authority of the past, but the authority of 20th century medicine.
The drawings are over in this corner of the gallery over here if you want to have a look later. I'd have loved to have heard the conversation that Francis was having with his patient.
Yes, I've got...
We're going to use some 500-year-old drawings to operate on your heart. Is that okay?
Yes. There's this bloke called Leonardo da Vinci, right?
I've got a book on Leonardo, and he was a genius, so it must be true.
He's got a great smile. Half smile. You'll be fine. Don't worry, just like that.
Yeah. So these are some of the drawings that Leonardo was making around this time, and they show such maturity of scientific understanding, such, you know, complete possession of both observation but also principle that you're seeing here. And it's the period that Leonardo is closest to publishing all these treatises, and I think this is one of the great unknowables, is what would the future of so many of these scientific areas have been had Leonardo published.
So how long did it take for posterity to realise the extent of how far Leonardo had got along the path of truth in this, that, or the other discipline? When was the nature of his achievement in thinking recognised?
It's not properly appreciated until the late 19th century. Jean-Paul Richter published his great literary works of Leonardo da Vinci in, I think, 1883, and he was the first scholar to take the time to transcribe, translate, and order so many of Leonardo's writings. And that is the watershed in our understanding of Leonardo. From that moment on, Leonardo is the Renaissance man. Before that date, he's a curiosity. He would have been seen in the same way that Charles II saw him in 1670, if he even bothered to open the album, which was as somebody who, he was a great painter, but he should have got on with being a painter and not dabbling in all these other crazy subjects.
I mean, he certainly, if you think of Sir Joshua Reynolds writing the discourses, giving the discourses, you know, published them in 1782, something like that, and you know, Michelangelo is the great artist.
Yes.
And Leonardo really isn't, I mean, Raphael's close, but I'm not sure whether Leonardo's even in the same race in Reynolds's mind. But
Reynolds's discourses do rely on some knowledge of Leonardo's treatise. The treatise was published, the great treatise on painting.
No, absolutely. I mean, in a sense, Reynolds is following in Leonardo's footsteps, and Leonardo is, I suppose, following Ghiberti and predicting Vasari in arguing that artists, us, especially an artist like me, who can do so much, you know, we are great men.
Yes.
And I think that's Reynolds's fight, is to make English people understand that an artist could be a great man too. So in that sense, but in the sense of admiring him viscerally, in a way that he admires Michelangelo, he doesn't.
Yeah, and you know, I don't even know how much of Leonardo's works of art Reynolds would have known. It's possible that he saw these drawings in George III's library, but we've got no evidence of it. The number of paintings by Leonardo himself, rather than school of Leonardo, that Reynolds would have known, would have been very few. And so his impression of Leonardo as an artist would have been very hazy, as it was really into the 20th century. But Reynolds, we have in the library at Windsor, Reynolds' own copy of an English translation of Leonardo's treatise, so we know that he owned this. But this big question of how Leonardo has been regarded down the ages is a trickier one than one might expect. And a question that, I mean, we're coming to the end of our slot now, but the question that I'm asked so often is, what does Leonardo mean to us today? What relevance does he have? What status does he have as a painter? Has our appreciation of Leonardo as a thinker, as a scientist, actually overtaken our appreciation of him as a painter, which is how he was regarded primarily for 400 years?
For me, when I look at these drawings, one of the things that I think is how difficult it is for anyone alive now, especially someone that's still at school now, how difficult will it be for them ever to because so much is mediated now by the phone and the photograph, and everything's done like click, 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 click. To actually make an image yourself of an embryo. I mean, Francis says this as well. He makes his students draw the heart because he believes that if you don't draw it, and if you spend an hour and a half or 2 hours in the presence of an object, whether it's a shell or a clump of turf like Dürer drew, or whether it's that water lily, or you have a closeness to reality that I think that, for me, Leonardo is there behind every one of these, saying, remember, you can have this closeness of relationship with nature yourself or with reality if you're prepared to spend time with it. And I think there's a danger of our technology stopping our minds working. And so many original things and original thoughts come through just staying in the same focused, concentrated place, if you like. And that these images they're almost like looking at another world of attention, not just another world.
Yeah. Certainly when we took these drawings around the country earlier this year, we went to 12 venues across the UK, 12 drawings at each venue. They were seen by more than 1 million people, and Leonardo has this appeal to all walks of life that I don't think any other artist has. But I was really struck by the strongest responses to the drawings coming not from people who are habitual gallery goers, but from the scientific community, from people who said Leonardo shows what science should be, that it's a creative subject, that it's something that requires curiosity and deep looking and an awareness of the interconnectedness of structures, for example, how the same principles can be applied on different scales across so many different areas of the natural world. And for me, that's one of the strongest lessons that Leonardo has to us now.
I suppose also, there's the one, when we look at the variety of slides that you've shown, for example, it makes me think how even those who really do want to pursue serious study, they're all trapped in their own little disciplines nowadays, because, which is no fault of their own. You need to know so much to be up to speed with the latest in chemistry. But there is a big loss in that specialization. Leonardo, who knows, there's a case, as it were, in cricket, you can be a batsman or a bowler or an all-rounder. Leonardo is very much the all-rounder, but the all-rounder is a bit of an endangered species in our world. And there's room for them.
Andrew, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was a great insight for me. Getting responses from people who've looked across so many different areas of the arts, as you have, is tremendously interesting. There's a great danger of looking only at Leonardo, of seeing him in a bit of a bubble. And I think we must always try and step back from Leonardo, just try to see him in the whole piece, but also see him in the context, not just of his time, but of the whole current of art. And in some ways he's unique, but at the same time he speaks to so many different periods and activities, not just in European culture, but in world culture, that I think we can do a great deal with him that we can't with any other artist. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now we have 15 minutes for questions. to continue this conversation. And as Matthew said, he and Lucy are poised with microphones. There's a gentleman here, Lucy, on the second row, if you can squeeze in there.
Well, first of all, thank you both very much indeed. That's been fascinating. You said or asked what would have happened if Leonardo had published his advanced material and how so many disciplines would have changed. Why didn't he publish?
Well, my simple explanation is that he was a perfectionist, that he was, he constantly rails in his notes against the abbreviators as people who are satisfied to cut knowledge short. And partly that's a complaint against established knowledge, but also against the university system and scholars in general, and I know that I'm probably guilty of that myself. But he wanted, in all of his scientific studies, to get down to fundamental principles. And when he's looking at the heart or at water or at optics, there's always more to know. You can see that, of course, in the human body. As soon as he gets this insight that the human body is perfectly formed to fulfill all its functions, then he is of the opinion that every single nodule of the body has a function, much as Andrew was saying about the heart studies, for example, that the precise form of the valves of the heart, they are that shape because they fulfill their function perfectly. So he needed to know what every single nook and cranny of the body was there for. It's probably an impossible task. But in his anatomical studies, he wanted to go further and further and further and further. In the field of water, he wasn't able to deduce general principles. He wanted to describe and enumerate every possible scenario in the movement of water. And so it's chapter after chapter after chapter after book, and he could never bring it to an end. And I think that lack of willingness to say, right, that's enough, that'll do. Leonardo could never say that'll do. It's why it took him 15 years to paint the Mona Lisa and so on, that there was always more to go. And I mean, it's very frustrating because the great drawings over here, he had with him in Rome between 1513 and 1516, which is when Marcantonio Raimondi is engraving Raphael's drawings for publication, for dissemination. And Marcantonio, of all people, would have been the engraver to translate Leonardo's drawings into a printable form. He's in Rome, where there's a burgeoning book printing industry. Leonardo could not have been in a better place to do it. But he had some slightly obscure run-in with the Pope and was banned from further dissection. We don't quite know what happened. And it seems to have completely taken the wind out of his sails as a scientist. And for the last 6 years of his life, he hardly studies the sciences at all. And when there's a description of a visit to his studio in October 1517, Antonio de Beatis, this chap who's writing about this visit, says he has a great many books which, if they're published, will be of great profit. So people understood, his contemporaries understood, this is just waiting to be published. But it never happened. So it wasn't until, as we were saying, the end of the 19th century that it was really understood.
It would have required a very sympathetic editor and perhaps a different... I mean, I don't know enough about the history of scientific publications, but I mean, when Harvey publishes about the circulation of blood, I mean, he's got a big point to make.
Yes.
Whereas Leonardo never had that big point to make. I mean, his intelligence was more, tended to run sideways a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what the conclusion or what would the advert for the book have said? Leonardo's thoughts on
everything.
Yeah. I mean, he could have published it in the same form as Montaigne's essays, maybe. But I don't know if that existed as a sort of scientific. Maybe somebody should have invented it. Yeah. Charles Nichols' book is good on that. I think I can't remember the name of it.
Flights of the Mind.
The Flights of the Mind was published a few years ago.
Any more questions? One in the front row here. Lucy, have you got the microphone
just
here?
in the front
row
here.
here.
Thank you. A really interesting discussion so far. So I had a question trying to link his paintings to his drawings and the connection to being a perfectionist. So, we were talking about the Last Supper. I think it was supposed to be a fresco, right? But one of the reasons it's difficult to keep intact is because it was painted over a long time and it was after it was dry, right? I guess fresco is supposed to be painted while it was wet. So we know that he did that to not experiment, but he did over time so that it didn't stay over long periods of time. But I just want to link it to the drawings. So like he experimented for the fresco, were there sort of any experiments he did in these drawings that we can look back and say, hey, that was experimental for the time?
Well, the Last Supper isn't in fresco, which is the reason that it is in such poor condition. Leonardo never worked in fresco, as far as we know. He was in Andrea del Verrocchio's workshop as a young man, and Verrocchio never practiced in fresco. So there were artists such as Ghirlandaio, Filippino Lippi, and so on, his contemporaries, who were working in fresco, but Leonardo never did, and it was completely uncongenial to him as an artist. And fresco requires you define an area that you're going to paint wet plaster on, you paint that, and then you move on to the next bit. Whereas Leonardo wanted to keep on going back over and over and adding further and further glazes. So he invented this experimental technique of oil and tempera and glue and probably, God knows what else thrown into it, to try and make the equivalent of oil paint on a dry wall surface.
It's called Provare fresco.
And it was popping off, of the surface already within Leonardo's day. In the field of drawings, it's not so much that he experiments, though he is the first major artist that we know of to use red chalk in such a exquisite way. He comes to chalk quite late. It's a bit of a puzzle because there are some exquisitely beautiful drawings by Verrocchio in black chalk. So Leonardo must have known the use of black chalk in Florence. But when he starts to use chalk for himself in the 1490s, it's as if he's never seen chalk being used. And the drawings that we have for the Last Supper, the head of St. James and the head of St. Philip, they're tentative. It's like he doesn't know what you can do with chalk. It takes him about 5 years until he properly appreciates the tonal subtlety that you can get from chalk. Once he's got it, as the drawings right behind me here show, he completely understands what incredible tonal effects you can get from chalk.
Does he use his fingers? Does he?
A little. He likes to just wet the tip of the chalk with his tongue and just get some sharp little accents with that. You can see them in the St. Anne there around the sort of the braiding around a hair, and there's a study of trees in the other room where you can see just where he's touched it. But rubbing is necessarily imprecise, whereas Leonardo is trying to get precision in so many of his drawings. He sometimes uses a stump, a little sort of rolled up piece of leather or paper, but using a finger, that's much too...
Do you think
smudgy.
Seurat knew his drawings? When Seurat does this amazing sort of sfumato.
Well, he could have done, because what's his name, Adolf Braun publishes reproductions of many of the Louvre drawings in the 1870s, and so Seurat could well have known Leonardo's in the Louvre.
But I'd have said these are pretty amazingly experimental in terms of bringing sfumato and chiaroscuro, which I think of as being painterly qualities, into the world of drawing. Perhaps more pronouncedly than I don't know any other Renaissance draftsman who does it as pronouncedly as
No,
that.
not the mixture of media. The study for the Madonna's arm that we have at the bottom left of this group here, which is red chalk preparation, charcoal, black chalk, pen and ink, wash, white heightening, and red chalk. Virtually every medium that Leonardo has is to make one drawing about
but
so
it's an
big.
amazing object.
Yeah.
It's an incredible object. It's the sort of thing that if a contemporary artist was going to choose one drawing, I wouldn't be surprised if they chose that, because it's almost got that feeling of I don't know, it's just so powerful.
Yes.
As a thing. I mean, he is brilliant I think that's another part of him, is that he's often, you know, he's criticised because he's fragmentary and he thinks in fragments, but boy, aren't they great fragments?
Thank you. Any more questions? Lucy, the second row right in the middle, gentleman with the green sweater on.
Thank you. How do you know, are all the drawings dated? As to how do you know which is the chronological, especially the medical ones?
Very few of Leonardo's drawings have a date on them, and not only one drawing that I can think of is a drawing that is dated to say this is the date I made this drawing. There are some sheets where you have drawings and Leonardo's written a date on it elsewhere, but that's not dating the drawing as such. It's a long process of tying drawings to the known documented projects. So you can start with the paintings that are of known date. There are some drawings, such as a skull drawing, which has the date 1489, and you can use that as a fairly reliable date for that. Some of the scientific studies have got, the notes have got dates embedded within the text. Not many, again, not many, but enough to start to get a basic structure. And then on the basis of that and the drawings that where you know an approximate date, you can then see a very clear stylistic development within Leonardo's work. His style does change dramatically during the course of his career. I wouldn't want to say that you can date every drawing to a year, but you can date most drawings to within a 5-year span with some confidence. I wouldn't say with certainty. But when you've got such a mass of material as you have with Leonardo, there's a huge amount to go at. You know, you've got something like 2,000 loose drawings by Leonardo, and the notebooks in addition to that. And with such a mass of material, drawings can be sort of clustered, and within them you can see the evolution of knowledge, which then allows us to put the drawings into a certain sequence. And sort of gradually, it's a huge jigsaw puzzle, but gradually it fits it all falls into place. I mean, there are some drawings where the dating is difficult. I mean, some of these behind me here, I wouldn't like to say whether they're nearer 1510 or 1515. There are very, very few drawings by Leonardo where the attribution is genuinely in debate. The fact that he's left-handed helps enormously because you can tell left-handed draftsmanship from right-handed quite easily. But it just becomes an immense edifice where style, medium, connection to projects, internal knowledge all fit together in one great flow. It's not a connoisseur's eye where you just go, that must be such and such. It's a matter of comparing with a bigger body of work. But you know, the efforts of many scholars over the last probably 150 years have allowed us to know the dates of these with some confidence.
Thank you.
Anyone else? I've got one on the front row here, Lucy.
I'm glad you asked about dating, because that was going to be my question too. And I'd like to ask something perhaps a bit more specific with regard to dating. I've done quite a lot of research into the Festa del Paradiso, which was, as you know, this huge sort of theatrical spectacle that he put on when he was working for Ludovico Sforza. And it's been incredibly frustrating linking that to any particular drawing, to a single drawing. Yeah. And we know that there was 4 hours of dancing. As far as I know, no yoga involved, but 4 hours of dancing. And there's a beautiful image of a dancer, which I think is somewhere here behind this screen, which is always definitively linked to his late period. Yeah. And I've always found, as I say, I found it so frustrating not being able to find anything that is, I know that is linked to that Festa del Paradiso. Do you know anything that is? And can you put your hand on your heart and say that is definitely linked to his French period and definitely wasn't done when he was in Milan?
Not to put you on the spot.
Yeah, I would go to the stake on that being a late drawing. There's just no way in terms of style, technique, materials and so on that it can be as early as that. I mean, there are some fragments I mean, literally, postage stamp sized, cut from manuscripts in the Codex Atlanticus by Melzi of studies for headdresses and masks and so on that are probably connected with that. It's only really at the end of Leonardo's life, these great costume studies that we have on the wall there, that we have a decent quantity of material that can be connected with the festivities that he was making. The study on the end wall in the blue gallery in this little thing, it's sort of monstrous building chasing a man, and if you turn it round, there's a study of the heavens, which is probably connected with Taccone's Danae, which was performed in January 1496. So we do know some designs for his Milanese festivities, but the Paradiso, no. It's, I mean, like so many of these things, we know that artists designed temporary festivities and stage sets and pageants and papier-mâché triumphal arches, but none of it survives, of course, in the original, and the drawings have usually gone. Leonardo is one of the few artists where we have a decent quantity of drawings from the Renaissance period, at least, that can be connected with individual festivities. But we know he was doing this throughout his life. In some cases, it's hard to tie a drawing with a particular festivity with any certainty.
Didn't he design a housing of some kind for one of the nails of the cross?
Did he?
I believe he was employed by the Sforza there was a nail from the cross, a nail that had pierced Christ's hand, kept in Milan Cathedral, and that Leonardo was asked to create something, I think, that enabled it to be suspended from the ceiling above the Mass on a particular day, but maybe Good Friday. But
extraordinary.
Unless this is all just... Yeah, well, it's a strange one, isn't it, to dream up.
I think we've got time for just one more question, then right at the back there.
Thank you. I've got a question for Martin. Why do you think that Leonardo da Vinci kept so many drawings? I mean, there were so many that it showed real commitment. I mean, he moved from court to court. So why do you think he kept them? Because he even kept his mistakes as well, the evolution of some of the anatomical drawings. Why did he keep them all?
I'm not sure he saw them as mistakes. I think he would have seen them as valuable background material. I mean, clearly he kept his scientific drawings because they were all studies towards a treatise that he hoped, even if that hope had faded in his last years, he hoped would one day be published. I do believe that at the end of his life, Leonardo would have looked back on his career and seen it as something of a failure, and that so many of the projects that he worked on during his life had come to nothing. Maybe 20 paintings by him had been finished. Some of them were unfinished, though they do survive to this day. But none of his equestrian monuments was ever built. We don't really know about his architectural work, how much of that was ever constructed. Certainly no building today can be identified as having been designed by Leonardo. No sculpture survives that's certainly by Leonardo. None of the scientific treatises were published. Many of the engineering projects never reached fruition, and so on. And for Leonardo, I'm sure he would have seen his life's work as being contained in his drawings, and that he was so careful to preserve his drawings and to pass them on in his will to Melzi, because he knew that at a really profound level, his life's work was in his drawings and not in any other form. And I think that's why he kept them all.
Well, there's another, what that makes me think of is Turner bequeathed to the British nation something like 17,000 watercolours, which are all supposedly studies. And as Lawrence Gang once said, well, why would he want them all to be kept if he didn't think that they were valuable? And didn't he perhaps think that they were himself? That was him, and they were his, as it were, his monument. But I would have thought that in the case of Leonardo, that's absolutely the case. That maybe he even had some idea that someday
That'd be an exhibition like this, yeah.
Yeah, a little modest little exhibition like this.
On that note, I think we're out of time. Andrew, thank you so much
Thank you,
for
Martin.
the conversation.
Cheers. Thanks very much.